Vignette 4: Defense of a River Line and Roadblock at Sayad by Commander Haji Abdul Qadir. In late summer and early fall of 1983, the Mujahideen in Najrao and Tegao districts of Kapisa province increased their attacks on government facilities. These districts are located on the east side of the Panjshir River and link Sarobi on the Kabul-Jalalabad highway with key locations in the provinces of Parwan, Kapisa, and Laghman. These districts also provided access to several Mujahideen mountain base camps. The only permanent bridge across the Panjshir River at Abdullah-i-Burj is located in this area and provides direct access to Bagram. We expected Soviet DRA forces at Bagram to launch a strike through the area. Their purpose would be to protect Sarobi and the main road connecting Sarobi with the Kapisa province capital of Muhammad-i-Raqi and Gulbahar, located further north at the mouth of the Panjshir Valley. We decided to block this expected advance with my forces and the forces of Commander Shaheen, based around Mahmudi-Raqi. We prepared defensive positions on the north bank of the Panjshir River around the bridge at Abdullah-i-Burj, map 6-4 Sayad. We built blocking positions in a deep ditch which passes through Upper Sayad village and covers the road as it approaches the bridge. We prepared positions on the high ground south of the river, which dominates the approach of both banks of the river. We put in landmines and built shelters with overhead cover to protect our Mujahideen from air and artillery fire. We moved supplies forward to a forward supply base in Dababi village, immediately northwest of Sayad village. We built covered trenches from the base to the forward positions. The trenches were big enough to allow us to resupply by pack horses, mules, and foot porters. Commander Shaheen had approximately 600 men, and I had approximately 250. There was not enough space to deploy them all, so 1/3 of the force occupied fighting positions, while the rest were in reserve or given support tasks. Some Mujahideen held flank positions to contain the enemy. Since all of the Mujahideen were locally based, we were able to deploy the blocking force in total secrecy. This helped surprise the enemy and hit him at a time and place where he was not fully ready to react effectively. Early on the morning of 31 October 1983, Soviet and DRA forces moved out of their Bagram base along two parallel routes and approached the Abdullah-i-Burj bridge. I estimate the strength at several regiments backed by strong artillery support and ample logistics. Tanks and APCs led the column. As the head of the column reached the lower Sayad village on the southern bank, the tail of the column had not cleared their Bagram base some 10 kilometers to the southwest. As the enemy tanks and APCs passed through lower Sayad village toward the river, we opened fire and took the enemy by surprise. It took the enemy some time to react and find our positions. We intensified our fire as more vehicles of the enemy column came into anti-tank weapons range. We hit several of their vehicles and they started to burn. Instead of trying to secure the bridge by infantry, the enemy continued to push his tanks and APCs toward the bridge. One tank and two APCs made it to the bridge, but we knocked them out at the bridge site. The enemy stopped and began pounding suspected Mujahideen positions with artillery fire and air attacks. He also began indiscriminately bombing the area, including the surrounding villages. However, our blocking force was well entrenched and protected against the enemy fire. Most of our Mujahideen moved into the covered shelters for the duration of the enemy fire preparation. As soon as the enemy began to shift his fire so that he could launch an attack, our Mujahideen would reoccupy their fighting positions and engage enemy infantry and tanks with mortars, machine guns, 82mm recoilless rifles, and RPG-7s. The news of our defense against the Soviet DRA forces soon spread throughout the area and reached as far as Kabul, Charikar, and Panjshir. Mujahideen from these areas began to move to the fight. This had a demoralizing impact on the enemy as these Mujahideen began probing attacks against his flanks and rear. In early afternoon, the enemy reinforced his efforts with some DRA troops and launched another attack to clear the roadblock. We drove back the attack and inflicted heavy casualties on the enemy. In the late afternoon, The enemy again conducted heavy artillery and airstrikes on our positions. Artillery, jets, and helicopter gunships took their turns against us, and then a Soviet unit attacked us. We defeated this attack as well. During the night, the enemy tried to attack across the bridge 3 times. Each time he was unsuccessful. The river could not be forded by vehicles, and he did not try using infantry and assault boats to cross at another point to outflank us. Probably the number of Mujahideen who had come to the fight on both sides of the river discouraged the enemy from risking an infantry assault crossing at night. On the morning of 1 November, the enemy resumed heavy artillery fire and air attacks. At the same time, we detected enemy activity toward the south. Around 1000 hours, the enemy facing the bridge began to break contact. Most of their troops headed south across the plain on the southern bank of the Panjshir River. We later found out that the enemy built an engineer bridge across the river near Shoki, some 20 kilometers downstream, and crossed there to move against Nizhao and Tagau districts. Seeing the enemy withdraw, we left our positions and collected what the enemy had left behind. The next day, we pushed their disabled tanks and APCs off the bridge into the river. Commentary. The Soviet DRA force did not lead with reconnaissance, nor did it use forward detachments to seize potential choke points before it moved. The Soviet DRA force was evidently surprised by the strong resistance they met. Had they detected the Mujahideen roadblock in advance, they could have dealt with it more effectively than trying to force a crossing through repeated frontal attacks. The Soviet DRA force had several options besides frontal attacks. First, they could have moved DRA forces from Jabul-e-Sarraj and Gulbahar in the north to attack the Mujahideen positions from the flank and rear, since these forces were already garrisoned across the river. Second, they could have conducted an infantry assault, crossing at an unopposed site, and then attacked the Mujahideen position from the flank. Third, if speed was essential, the planners could have selected the option it was later forced to choose after sustaining losses and losing much time at the Abdullah-i-Burj bridge. Once delayed by a strong Mujahideen resistance, the Soviet DRA columns acted very slowly to try to seize the initiative. Tanks were ineffective in forcing the bridge. The Soviet DRA force needed to use well-trained infantry to seize the dominant Ku-i-Top mountains quickly. This mountain was on their side of the river and would facilitate forcing the bridge. By allowing the column to stall in a Mujahideen area, the Soviet DRA force become vulnerable to flank and rear attacks by local Mujahideen. Quick, decisive action is key to the survival of a stalled, surrounded force. Mujahideen secrecy while planning and implementing the roadblock was commendable. The local commanders coordinated their actions and the force fought staunchly. Their well-prepared defensive positions allowed them to survive artillery fire and air bombardment. The Mujahideen had the advantage of fighting on home turf with local support. Had the Mujahideen developed a more effective system of operational cooperation and coordination, the enemy column might have succeeded in reaching Najrao and Tagau. Lack of a viable operational command and control system prevented the Mujahideen at Abdullah-i-Burj, Shoki, Najrao, and Tagau from acting together. A more elaborate operational coordination could mobilize the Mujahideen forces at Shoki to prevent the Soviet DRA troops from crossing the river to Kapisa province. Vignette 5. The Defense Against the Soviet Operation Magistral by General Gulzarak Zadran, Lieutenant Omar Maulawi, Nezamuddin Haqqani, and Maulawi Abdul Rahman. Quote, "We were a very desperate people without much equipment or armaments, but we had the power of our faith, love of our homeland, love of freedom, and reliance on the Almighty. We were fighting against very heavy odds." General Gulzarak Zadran. Sources in the DRA warned us that a combined Soviet DRA force would launch an offensive to open the road between Gardez and Kaust. We Mujahideen closed the road in March 1979, and the government had supplied their garrison at Kaust by air ever since. The DRA had tried to open the road on many occasions and had 2 entire regiments annihilated in the process. The road had become a thing of myth, the Mujahideen-held road that no power could open. We watched the enemy mass his forces and supplies in Gardez in November 1987. This was clearly going to be a major 40th Army operation involving forces from several Soviet motorized rifle divisions, the Soviet Airborne Division, DRA units, Spetsnaz, massed artillery, surface-to-surface missiles, and Soviet air power. At the time, General Zadran analyzed the impending operation to determine its operational significance. He determined two possible goals for the operation. This unprecedented massing of such a major force either meant that the Soviets wanted to escalate the war by threatening Pakistan directly from Paktia, or the Soviets wanted to shatter the myth that the Mujahideen along the Gardez-Khoust highway are invincible by opening the unopenable road. If the Soviet goal was to escalate and to threaten Pakistan, then the Soviets needed to bring more forces to Paktia province after they opened the road to Khoust. General Zadran thought that this was too dangerous a gamble for the Soviets to take, considering the probable international and regional implications. Instead, General Zadran concluded that the Soviets meant to show their military might to the world by doing the impossible, so that they could then end the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan and withdraw with a solid victory to their credit. In order to accomplish the impossible, the Soviets needed to force the main road from Gardez with at least a division, and having achieved the breakthrough, move toward Khoust to link up with the DRA 25th Infantry Division, which would try to open a corridor to the west. General Zadran's final analysis was that the Soviets needed to flex their muscles by opening the road that had been closed for all those years. We started to prepare for the Soviet offensive against the Satakandao Pass. The shoulders of the pass loom some 400 meters over the road, and once in the pass, the road follows a slow, twisted route packed with hairpin curves. It is an excellent place to defend. We reinforced the minefields along the road. We laid 3 mine belts on a 3-kilometer front at the opening of the pass with 300 to 400 meters between mine belts. We reinforced our positions on the high ground overlooking the road and pass. We had a total of 10 BM-12s in the area. We crowned the pass with ZGU-1 air defense machine guns. These are both good positional weapons, but are very difficult to displace rapidly when the situation requires. We also had Dushka machine guns, 75mm and 82mm recoilless rifles, and plenty of RPG-7s. Haji Nawab Khan commanded the Satakandao Pass approach. 2 kilometers to the west of the Satakandao Pass is the Kadai Pass, a secondary pass with a dirt trail going through it. We reinforced the defenses here as well. Ismail commanded the Kadai Pass approach, map 6-5 Magistral. Most of the Mujahideen in this area were local men who were defending their own villages. Unlike other parts of Afghanistan, the people still lived here and had not been driven out to the refugee camps in Pakistan. The majority of the people in the area belonged to the Zadran tribe, but other tribes and different factions were also involved. The decision to prepare and the decision to fight was not made by the factions, but by the tribal council. This was to be fight for homes and neighborhoods. Our local major commanders were Malawi, Nizamuddin Haqqani, Mullah Ibrahim, Mullah Abdurham, Captain Zan Zamak, Izzat Khan, Gadeh, Dul Khan, Ghanem K, Sadat, Hakam, Jung, Dr. Kiali, Badshah, and Alif. We focused our efforts on the main road where it runs through the Satakandao Pass. There is another road some 7 kilometers to the east which goes through the Soroti Pass and joins the main highway at Lakatiga, some 25 kilometers to the south of the Satakandao Pass. This is a poor road which passes through the Dari Kel tribe. We did not expect that the Soviets would want to move vehicles along this road, so we did not mine it. However, we did reinforce the local Mujahideen in this area. Each tribe sent Harbakai to help, and we sent about 300 Harbakai as reinforcements to the Soroti Pass in the Dari Kel area. Commander Badshah commanded the Soroti approach. The Soviets established forward bases at Dara and Zawa. They deployed their artillery in division artillery groups, DAGs, near Dara and deployed their army artillery group further back south of Gardez. They moved a maneuver force to Zawa. Suddenly, they launched an attack from Zawa towards Soroti. We were completely taken by surprise. In 4 to 5 days of fighting, the Soviets pushed us back to the Soroti approach. Commander Badshah was killed in the fighting. Kadir Shah took over command and fought a stubborn withdrawal back through the Soroti Pass, Map 6-6, Phase 1. Once the Soviets captured the Soroti Pass, they launched air assaults, landings on the high ground located between the main road and the road through the Soroti Pass. They now held key terrain controlling both axes with air assault troops and small caliber artillery. From these peaks, they could hit our positions and support their advance through the Satakandao Pass on the main road. At the same time, they could support their continued advance along the Soroti approach. Their sudden seizure of the high ground between their two axes gave them a tremendous advantage. The Soviets began bombing the Mujahideen headquarters at Sarani. Command and control suffered greatly from the shelling. The Soviets on the high ground began directing artillery and rocket fire on the villages in both valleys leading from Satakandao and Soroti. The Zadrans in the villages had not emigrated and the Soviets wanted to displace them. They were successful. Many Mujahideen, concerned about the danger to their families, left the fighting to evacuate their families to Pakistan. This exodus opened the way for the further advance of the Soviet troops. They were now ready for the main attack on the Satakandao axes. The Soviets opened their operation against the Satakandao Pass with heavy airstrikes and artillery fire while they moved their maneuver forces to Dara. Then, once their positions were set, they flew an airplane over the pass at high altitude, dropping paratroopers. Reconnaissance aircraft flying at much higher altitudes trailed the aircraft that was dropping the paratroopers. We engaged the paratroopers with all our air defense machine guns and whatever other air defense weapons we had. As the paratroopers drifted closer, we realized that we had been duped. The paratroopers were dummies, and the reconnaissance aircraft had photographed our response and pinpointed our positions. The Soviets now began firing on our positions in earnest. Heavy artillery strikes followed airstrikes, which were followed by more artillery strikes. We were pinned down in our positions by the strikes, which continued for hours. Our positions were generally artillery-proof but not bomb-proof, and, thanks to their reconnaissance, they were hitting our positions exactly. They then launched their ground attack, but we readily defeated it. The next day, 1 December 1987, they resumed their heavy shelling and bombing. The overwhelming force of their artillery and air power took the initiative from us. There were no Soviet forces garrisoned in Paktia, and we were used to fighting the DRA. The DRA had no artillery larger than 130 millimeter. Now we were getting pounded by heavy artillery, including BM-21 and BM-27 MRL. In Dara, the Soviets had 3 powerful long-range heavy artillery pieces with 4 tires each. We saw one of these firing. The firing recoil gases alone flipped a jeep over. Aircraft were dropping cluster bombs on us. We could not survive in these positions, so we left our positions and moved to higher mountains in the west called Gumbor Kuali and Fakhri. The Soviets advanced on our positions behind us, and after 5 days, they seized the Sakandao Pass. We had cut and destroyed sections of the road in the Satakandao Pass. As the Soviets tried to repair the road, we started firing on them with our heavy weapons and from the high ground. But the Soviet firepower was strong, and the Soviets pushed us higher into the mountains. As their converging forces cut our rear, we fell back. They captured Gulzarak Zadran's base at Shwak. The Mujahideen took what equipment they could, but some had to be abandoned to the enemy. The Mujahideen withdrew to the southwest mountains, and the Soviets/DRA advanced and established a base camp where they stayed for 2 days. Then they resumed their advance to Sarani. They destroyed the Mujahideen base camp at Sarani, our first indication that the Soviet DRA planned to abandon the route instead of trying to maintain a long-term presence there. The Mujahideen plight was serious, and we were suddenly faced with a new problem: the absence of drinking water. The intensity of Soviet shelling was so great that the chemical residue from the explosions had contaminated the streams. Some of us thought that the Soviets had poisoned the water, since one glass of water could choke you up and make you very ill. We had to use snow for drinking water, but the snow was also affected by the chemicals. Our supplies were cut off and food was scarce, but our major problem was thirst. People were suffering from dehydration, but they could not use the local water. We had not made arrangements to haul water into the area, since local water had always been adequate for our needs. The roads were blocked, so trucks could not enter the area. We had some mules, but we could use in some of the area, but we carried in most of our supplies by Mujahideen porters. The Soviets continued their move south. They preceded their movement by air assault landings to seize high ground on both sides of the road. Their columns would then advance under the protection of these picketing forces. As the Soviets moved forward, they left security OPs behind to secure their lines of communication. The Soviets reached Lakatiga, and the columns from Satakandao and Soroti linked up. After that, it was smoother for them. The Soviets/DRA left a security detachment at Lakatiga and advanced on Kaust. At the same time, a DRA detachment from the 25th Infantry Division moved west out of Kaust to link up with the approaching column. After the force secured the road to Kaust, they began moving supply columns along the road to resupply the beleaguered city. The tide was beginning to turn. The local Mujahideen who had taken their families to Pakistan returned. Malawi, Jalaluddin Haqqani, and other commanders, Matiullah, Mullah, Abdul Ghaffur, Gulzarat Zadran, Amanullah, Mullah Sadiq, Tawakkal, Abdurrahman, Wakil Wazir Muhammad, Pari, Padshah, Khan, and Sadat arrived and moved into the mountains west of the highway. Colonel Imam of the Pakistani ISI arrived and tried to coordinate the Mujahideen action. Haji Amanullah Khan and other commanders arrived. Mujahideen from other areas in Afghanistan arrived. Mujahideen and Taliban arrived from Pakistan. We were all eager to fight. The Mujahideen selected 12 commanders and assigned enemy outposts between Wazi and Satakandao for them to attack. The Soviets had moved into the side valleys, but the 12 commanders forced the Soviets out of the side valleys and confined them to the vicinity of the road. They then began attacking the road. Jalaluddin Haqqani was at Fakhri. Once again, Jalaluddin Haqqani was wounded during the battle, this time with shrapnel in his thigh. Although Haqqani was wounded, he stayed on for a week. Then he was evacuated on mule back over mountain pass to Miram Shah. The Soviets/DRA could only keep the road open for 12 days. Then they withdrew. When the Soviet air assault abandoned the heights, they took their weapons but left all the ammunition behind. The Mujahideen recaptured the road, and neither the DRA nor the Soviets could reopen it. Despite the intensity of battle, Mujahideen casualties were light. There were perhaps some 100 Mujahideen KIA. The villagers suffered greatly, and the villages were heavily damaged or destroyed. Some 80% of the villages in the area were damaged. Soviet DRA losses are unknown. The Mujahideen shot down 1 helicopter and 3 jets. As the Soviets withdrew, we captured 2 intact Soviet tanks and 4 trucks. Some 600 DRA soldiers defected or were captured. Most of them defected with their weapons. Commentary. Gulzarat Zadran's evaluation of the Soviets is not flattering. I should mention here that the Russian army is a worthless military institution, and that no professional soldier will give them a high mark in discipline or the will to fight. They are useless. I should also note that the Russians relied throughout the action on maximum use of artillery, and one Mujahideen would draw the fire of a battery or more for several minutes. The high peaks which they occupied by hellborn troops helped them a lot. Even there, they surrounded themselves with all sorts of mines, and these bears would be sitting around, lighted campfires to keep themselves warm in the winter, so the peaks were on fire all night. The Soviet Air Force was not very effective because they flew very high, probably out of fear of our stingers." End quote. Despite General Zadran's comments, the Soviet planning and execution of this operation was well done. It matches the initial Soviet invasion in tactical surprise, the use of multiple axes, operational tempo, and innovation. The fire support and logistics portion of the plan were first rate, and the use of dummy paratroopers was masterstroke. The use of air assault forces was well planned and executed. The Soviets needed a save face operation before withdrawal, and Magistral was just that.